welcome to SciLux, the podcast where we talk about scientific developments and technological changes in Luxembourg, not only, but today Luxembourg. And this means that we are powered by Research Luxembourg and recording at the Media Center of the University of Luxembourg. But our guest today will take us actually a little bit overseas and will take us to Italy, and we will travel a lot because our guest is Professor Massimo Morelli, who is quite a persona. So I'm very, very excited to have him today because, listen to this bio. After completing his PhD at Harvard University, Massimo Morelli pursued his academic career in the United States, where he was professor of economics and political science at Columbia University before moving to Bocconi University. He is a fellow of the Society for the Advancement of Economic Theory and the Econometric Society, and currently senior researcher working part-time at LISER. That's why we have him here in Luxembourg. Massimo's research topics range from economics, politics, and law. So we have really a very interesting mixture, interdisciplinary approach, and I hope you will manage to hear it today when we talk. Massimo, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, as I said, because we have so many different topics, I was thinking where to set the scene first, but in some places when I was reading about you, you just said also, I look at economics in general. And I was just wondering, where are we with economics? We've had this mistrust, distrust at certain moment, and now we are kind of coming back. So what's the research about right now in economics?
Well, economics has traditionally been considered a social science that was a bit more technical, mathematical, quantitative with respect to other social sciences. But nowadays, many economists agree that indeed a lot of sociological, psychological dimensions related mostly to trust affect economic performance, economic behavior, functioning of states a lot. And this is very important. And you can think of horizontal trust being, the trust among or between individuals or between firms. This is the trust that makes market work, that makes trade possible, reciprocity, all these issues that horizontally allow a market to work. But also what is becoming very important in terms of problematicization is actually the vertical trust, namely, how much trust do we have in institutions, in the fact that what we will pay as voters in taxes, etc., will actually be used correctly, or the fear of exploitation by institutions, by the elites. So this vertical set of concerns is affecting also economic decisions at many levels.
But then you said that it's more kind of mathematical based and quantitative and all that. So how do you quantify trust when you're researching
Well,
it?
so recently there are new methods that involve also analysis of texts with more sophisticated techniques. But the traditional way to evaluate trust is through surveys, right? Through a set of questions and questionnaires across countries over time. Even when the survey is made at the national level, like in the US, for example, it was the national level of trust of all kinds was collected only every 4 years and not district by district. But then it is possible with this more sophisticated method to recover measures of trust at the district level by post-stratification. So by seeing, for example, among the national respondents, which ones are the category that display significant reduction of horizontal or vertical trust, and then seeing how many of those categories that are problematic, so to speak, in terms of reduction of trust are present in one or the other district, right? So that you can therefore reconstruct how is this trust changing, not only over time, but also more in one district than in another, and seeing how these differential changes from district to district, how are they affecting behavior by voters and by economic agents in those districts.
This is a very interesting point as well, because there is this survey very dear to my heart, which is trust when it comes to science, because obviously these are also surveys that are done, right? And there is often this, I think, pride in Luxembourg, because a Luxembourgish society in general trusts scientists according to the survey. But then again, I always think, with politicians in general, I think we hopefully, if you are a little bit more present in the discourse, you are naturally more interested. You have to vote, especially in Luxembourg. You must vote. But with scientists, if you don't just see them, then you can just say, yes, theoretically, I trust them. It's a bit different, right?
Yeah, so in general, the problem of trust in science is not detached from the other forms of vertical distrust. Why vertical? Because in a sense, when we vote for someone, we are delegating him or her to do what is right when the time comes. And to do what is right when the time comes reflects the fact that we know less, typically, than the more specialized lawyers or politicians or economists that we elect. And also we know less than the scientists, experts that they may consult. Now, when vertical trust goes down, not only we are trusting less that the politicians will do things in our interest as they proclaimed when they campaigned, and maybe instead they will do what some quote-unquote elites will want them to do. But we are also afraid that the scientists themselves may be reflecting a reality or portraying a reality that is biased by perhaps what the elite wants. And that's the language that these days is going around, even though the elite, of course, means in different contexts, different things. And so the trust in science and the trust in politicians went down at the same time. And there is another reason for that maybe we'll get to later, namely that if politics has been changing in the direction of simple commitments, then it's natural that once a voter endorses a simple commitment, let's say, make America great again, like America first, then you don't want any scientist to come tell you that actually free trade would be good for us, because that kind of blocks the commitment that people voted for.
But it also means, in general, it's easier to trust simple commitments, right?
Yes, because simple commitments are monitorable. So if I campaign by telling you, like Trump did, that I will do mass deportations, then of course I'm anticipating that there will be propaganda images of a mass deportation in 2 or 3 videos. At the end, they will not deport millions of people, but they will try to show that that commitment has been, at least in part, implemented. And in any case, it's easier at relative terms to convince voters that the commitment is being implemented with respect to convincing them that they can continue to trust you no matter what you do.
But then in general, populists also tend to have these promises like, I don't know, your lives will be better, you will earn more money, you'll be richer, or whatever else. That's not really easy to keep as a promise.
No, but those are more like contextualizations, like to try to say why this commitment. But what enters the domain of commitments are more things like the 2 typical commitments of populists tend to be protectionism, namely close border, close markets, like protection from the substitution that you might fear that could come from immigrants or from businesses in Asia or what have you that operate with lower costs of labor and capital and therefore compete with your own firm, and your firm will be forced to fire you because they don't have enough business, etc. So that protectionism is always there. And the second commitment that is also simple to do is disengagement, like what Trump is doing today, like, international relations, international cooperation. These are things that are typically not interesting for a median voter who wants protection. Disengagement is a much more consistent type of commitment because basically not only a disengaging populist politician is perceived as someone who will save money from giving them to Ukraine, etc., and use that money perhaps for the American people, but also there is another reason. Going away from international cooperation commitments will probably, especially when done by a superpower, reduce the cost of energy, because by not cooperating to making all those important climate change reduction policies and green policies, you will make cost of energy lower and hence actually prices lower. And this allows Trump, for example, to say that he will go for tariffs that will protect the market without necessarily increasing inflation. So from the point of view of the economics, these two simple commitments, protectionism and disengagement, go a long way to convince the median voter. And therefore, it's very important in my research to show that, in a sense, a voter voting for populists should not be portrayed as someone who does not understand reality, but rather as someone who is selfish and perceives the economic interest involved in those reduction of prices plus isolation and protection from immigrants and globalization competition as all there is, right? But it is rational. If you are someone who really cares only about your own economic interest, it actually does make sense in this moment to vote for Trump.
Okay, well, the finish on the discussion, I don't know what to say, right? But I do know that we are talking about trust, and there is also another context for trust. So your pub quiz question that you prepared, and I think this is a right moment for you to ask before we move on to the heavyweight populism we're discussing.
I thought about a quiz for all of you that will, at the end, illuminate on the concept of trust. So the question is, how much do you think that is the percentage of plastic that we consume that is actually recycled at the end of the day? So out of 100 units of plastic, what is the percentage that at the end gets recycled? Below 15%, 30%, 45%, 70%, or above 85%? That's the question.
Great question, and listeners, remember the answer only at the end of the podcast. So now we're coming back to populism. As I said, you write a lot about it. So again, just the background story, and probably a difficult question to answer, but we have to start with that. What's going on? Why is it so much on the rise?
So I believe that the right is on the rise for primarily two reasons. One is more or less economic reason, namely, over time, many countries have increased their debt. Like we are thinking about Italy, for example, you mentioned, which is my country. Well, in the 70s, in the 80s, when the debt over GDP ratio was definitely below the critical ratio of 70%, it was feasible for the left to say, okay, we will increase welfare, we will increase redistribution, because we were not yet completely overburdened by debt. But now, with debt being 135% of GDP, and with all the austerity and other constraints given by Europe, etc., it is impossible to make a left type of protection policy economically feasible. Taxes are already very high, debt is too high. So what room of maneuver can a left government have to create protection for its citizens from the point of view of more public goods spending? Whereas the right has cheaper types of protection, identity protection, nationalism protection, closing borders. Those things do not have an extremely high economic cost, right? They have perhaps ethical cost. They have solidarity costs. They're ugly from my point of view. This is preferences. This is my ethical concerns. But from the point of view of this type of policies actually working, they work because they are credible. In terms of commitments, it is more credible to say, hey, I'm going to close borders tomorrow. Well, for Italy, it's harder, of course, because of the length of the costs, etc. But, for an average country, closing borders or closing markets is a bit easier than spending more on welfare policies. That's the economic reason. The other, of course, they say it's a cultural reason, namely, once we switch to identity protection as a viable and credible way to protect citizens, then, of course, this polarizes on the cultural dimension. So the example we like to use for the study we do on the United States is the example of the white male from the Midwest. The white male from the Midwest used to identify mostly with its class, which was like, a lower middle class in need of redistribution. But now with all this emphasis on immigration threat and China shock, etc., they identify more with whites against non-whites, or even fearing, the protection of the traditional rights of the male against the progressive gender equality campaigns of the left. And so it all shifted from the traditional left-right to a more like race and gender. And so therefore this cultural polarization is the second reason why the focus is more on that dimension of right.
Moving back from the States for a second, at least, to Europe, we are part of the European Union, at least some of the countries in Europe. Some of the policies we're talking about, the populist policies, are just not possible to implement because we are part of the European Union, or not?
Yes, the attempt to make populism increase in many countries in Europe was considered very important, according to some quote-unquote conspiracy theories, also by Putin, because the weakening of European Union is obviously to the advantage of countries outside the European Union, in particular Russia. And therefore, the allegations made in many countries that populist parties were endorsed or even helped by Russia is a conspiracy theory that I kind of broadly believe in. I don't have data, I don't have proofs, but I believe that it is possible. It makes sense. Why? Because we see how, for example, Ursula von der Leyen's government does not have a support that is enormous. They have the majority, but not the large majority. And you can see how even a few more members of European Parliament or a few more countries in the Council of Europe that potentially, moving to the Orban side would make it even harder to construct a coalition and to make moderate and efficiency-enhancing policies. And so, in a sense, even though it is true that so far the simple populist commitments have not percolated to the European Union level, but the threat is there and it's increasing as well. In my study, since I'm an economist and try to quantify things, I did study what makes it a little bit more difficult even in terms of electoral system. We have many proportional representational electoral systems in Europe, and that is actually a slowdown of the penetration of the populist message. Not surprisingly, in the US, you have a populist government precisely because the electoral system is as far as possible away from proportional representation.
So you were not surprised after the 5th of November?
No.
Okay.
I would have bet on it. But my wife did not allow me to put all my money on cryptocurrencies.
Well, maybe that's a good thing when you are an economist. At least somewhere you can make money, because as we know, scientists and money, that doesn't always go together. But yes, let's leave it there. Okay, so to what kind of a world have we woken up after the 5th of November? I know you also talk not only about the rise and the reasons, but also the consequences.
Yeah, there are consequences. So what we have studied so far in detail are the local consequences. By local, I mean at the level of municipal governments, because not only we see populism going up at the national levels, but also at the governor's level, district level, municipal level. And on municipalities, we have many data. For example, in Italy, we have data on 8,000 municipalities over 20 years. And with high frequency these days, the municipality goes from non-populist to populist, etc. So you can trace what happens when the change from non-populist to populist happens. And what you can see is that there are consequences in terms of larger debt, because once you make commitments, you want to do those commitments regardless of how many other things the mayor has to do. And most important, there is a tendency of pretty much all new populist mayors to replace expert bureaucrats with loyal bureaucrats, because the bureaucrats are those that can stop the commitments, since they do not want the commitments to be stopped. As soon as an expert bureaucrat says, hey, this is not particularly good, this violates this law, this violates this, okay, you're fired. And that's consistent with Trump at the moment in which he entered the campaign, making one of his ancillary commitments that of eliminating the deep state, the possibility for the executive to always fire bureaucrats. This is not only dangerous in the short run, and as we show, the deterioration of the quality of the bureaucracy is bad for economic and political governance at the local level, but also makes the governments less able to make reforms later on and actually make the governments less efficient in general. I have studied the consequences at the national level, especially for the legislation. So my specialty on the national level has been these days not to study the economic consequences of populism, because somebody else has studied the economic consequences. Apparently, according to a few papers, 15 years in power for a populist government can reduce, on average, GDP by 10%. So there is strong evidence of national aggregate effects. But what I studied is the legislative effects or the rule-making effects, because once you make the experts go away, the good bureaucrats go away, also, making it difficult for legislators to focus on what they write from the point of view also of readability, etc., because you have to fulfill some specific objectives, the quality of writings goes down so much that we show that this has terrible consequences also in terms of future functioning of the judicial sector, which is in any case a sector that populists don't like to strengthen, because again, judges and courts are other agencies of restraint that could block commitments. You don't want anybody to block populist commitments, and therefore even judges, even media, any type of experts, any type of bureaucrats, they are the checks and balances of society that populists typically these days try to weaken. And this is the most important thing, because liberal democracy has two pillars. Democracy, like, okay, let's go to vote, majority wins, etc. And liberal means protecting, for example, the rights of minorities. But hey, once you don't want checks and balances, you don't want judges, you don't want expert bureaucrats, the protection of minority rights are in danger, right? So we are going in general towards a type of democracy that is not really liberal. And we have a big trade-off. See the Romanian case now. It's not clear what position to take, because unless there are a lot of frauds going, one could argue that democracy was respected. But of course, the fear by those who would like to block that election is offer the liberal component. Yet, it's a very difficult question. We would like to have a liberal democracy, perhaps most of us, but it's not easy to argue that in order to maintain the liberal component, we want to go against democracy. So it's a very difficult and slippery slope.
And for me, also from a lay perspective, I think the slope becomes even more slippery when there is another government change after the populists, right? And then the new people on the block, the new politicians are trying to, should I say, clean up? Maybe that's not the best word, but figure out what to do with the country that is in some not great state, let's put it like that. And obviously they don't want to apply the same rules and the same approach as the predecessors.
Well, I think that the changes in governments are, in a sense, both a risk and an opportunity, So if you think about Poland, on the one hand, the rules of the game, of the institutions, allowed indeed the last elections to go back to a coalition government that excluded the PIS from government, even though they were the relative majority party. So in a sense, there is an opportunity because, yes, the rules of the game allow you to form this coalitional government and exclude the relative majority party. So the opportunity is, let's see if they can rebuild trust, if they can reobtain the trust that traditional politics had lost before. But of course, a risk, because if this trust is not rebuilt, then of course the tendency of the masses to try to, again, concentrate on giving back the power on a more nationalistic type of government will increase. So there are few opportunities, and I'm not very confident that rebuilding trust is easy at the national level. I'm more maybe excessively optimistic about Europe.
Exactly, because that's also something I heard you were saying in one of the lectures that are available online, and I'm going to share, of course, the ones that I listened to in the show notes, and the rest you can also find. There's quite a lot where Massimo is telling fascinating stories. But one of them that I was listening to was the one in New Zealand, actually, that you were giving. And there was something about the fact that, if you want to rebuild trust, you actually might end up with the voters distrusting even more, right?
Yes. Italy is a good example. Mario Draghi was a politician, prime minister before this government, with an extremely high reputation in terms of competence and also for what he did in the European Central Bank. And he has an immense positive reputation. And indeed, during the Draghi government, from the point of view of the numbers, he probably couldn't have done better in terms of bringing Italy from being the last or the second last country in Europe in terms of growth before Draghi to now being one of the countries that is actually faring better economically. So certainly the numbers are in favor of saying, yes, he did well. Yet the fact that many decisions were not shared and not understood and not explained, there was a sort of perhaps perception of paternalism, etc., actually this trust went further up. So having at the national level economic success is not enough to rebuild trust. What you need to do is to perhaps create new institutions that resolve a big trust issue. If now the one problem of trust is representation, right? No taxation without representation, then Europe is at an important juncture. Either we go towards a United States of Europe, where, in fact, voting for the European Parliament means voting for the Parliament that will generate the government that will, represent us, etc. Otherwise, if we pay taxes to our national governments and the representation is at the national level, and then some policies, like for the Green Deal is very important. Maybe many of us believe that the Green Deal is important, but still, it feels like an imposition from the top. And it's funny because institutionally, the European Union cannot really force much from the top other than trade policies, for example. Yet the perception is, and the perception was, that we were imposed by Europe certain policies, etc. So this is a big mistake. Not a big mistake to reduce gas emissions, of course, but to do it in a way that can be perceived as yet another obstacle to nationalist interests, and therefore further increasing the support for populist nationalists, is a bit of a suicidal route for Europe that needs to be avoided.
And also, you seem to be arguing actually more for the first idea you presented, so global policies or European policies as a solution to the populism in different countries.
Absolutely. So, if, for example, Europe could concentrate on creating things like unemployment insurance for all Europeans, where therefore the worker feels protected in terms of potential parachute in case of losing jobs by Europe rather than by the national unemployment insurance that is going bankrupt. No? So that is a type of policies that can create trust in Europe and can make people vote more for a pro-Europe party, etc. So at the center of the whole Europe, there is a possibility to do policies like this and focus on those.
And would be also rediscussing some kind of European tax policy, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. The taxation issue is very important because, as I said, at the national level, there is very little room of maneuver because the taxation at the national level is mostly labor income taxes, because capital taxes, wealth taxes are subject to a huge tax competition problem, and rich people, etc., can go away a la Gérard Depardieu if you tax them too much at the national level. Whereas at the European level, we could have the introduction of a small wealth tax and capital tax, and this would be creating more progressivity and at the same time could allow the individual nation states to actually reduce labor income taxes. And this will make a splash into the heart, of Italians and Germans and French, because they will see Europe as doing the correct type of substitutions. Yes, let's tax a little bit the multinationals with corporate sales taxes that they're not paying right now, and the very wealthy, and let's reduce my own labor income tax.
But we are meeting in Luxembourg. So, of course, this idea, I don't know whether it would go down well here.
So, you're right. But, Luxembourg is small. No, just kidding.
Watch out.
Exactly. No, I have to say that on this, even many people from Luxembourg that I know are concerned, because clearly, if you think about corporate sales taxes that I talked about, they mean that a multinational company could still be located in Luxembourg or in Ireland, but the advantages with respect to other companies would be reduced Because by moving to a larger percentage of corporate sales taxes, what this would mean, it would mean that they would have to pay, for example, let's say to the Italian government, some taxes that are proportional to the sales that are made in Italy. And so this should not be a transformation that would necessarily affect Luxembourg or the location of multinational companies. Of course, instead, the wealth tax would be more touchy-feely. Absolutely.
Okay, I moved smoothly to Luxembourg, so I have to continue actually asking you a little bit more, although I can feel you were trying to avoid a little bit. Have you had a chance to, look at our data, Luxembourg data?
Yes.
Because we have a tendency to be a bit in and a bit out for different things,
yes.
Populism included. So what have you
yes.
seen? What have you discovered?
Beside personal reasons, there is a strong reason for me to be a visiting researcher at LISER in Luxembourg. And that is because, as you gathered probably from what I said before, I am very concerned about the social issues and cultural issues. And Luxembourg is a great example of multicultural society. It's related to being also a very rich country, of course. But somehow in 60 years, Luxembourg went from 13% of foreign-born residents to 49%. And when you look at the transformation in terms of attitudes towards immigrants and attitudes towards race, etc., there is a little bit of worsening in the last 10 years, probably following all the political equilibrium that is changing in Europe, but very small compared to many other countries. That means that being in a society with such a large multicultural integration helps to not fall into too many stereotypes and fall into cultural hate and so that is definitely for me an important reason to be here and observe from inside the type of policies that have been used for integration, for inclusion, for diversity. And in fact, we have launched a project which now just got funded from the FNR on artificial intelligence and discrimination. So what we want to show is using the wealth of data that has been accumulated on these topics and the willingness to participate by the ministries, by the unemployment agencies, and so on. We want to explore how even technological change can help to reduce further discrimination or to avoid the increasing discrimination that may actually happening in other contexts. So Luxembourg can provide a lot of good insights to researchers in spite of its peculiarity, both in terms of size, because it's small, and in terms of course, GDP per capita, which is huge.
Of course, and great you mentioned the size, because we're actually talking straight after an international European episode that I recorded with Professor Godfrey Baldacchino from University of Malta. He's a social scientist and he studies small states, exactly. And I was just wondering, if you do all these studies in Luxembourg, like the one you are going to do right now, is it actually something that we can apply to larger states, or it can be just a very much case for Luxembourg because we're small?
Yeah, so what is difficult to do is comparison across countries, but the goal would be to then move in that direction. Right now, for example, I'm asking various parts of the government in Italy to replicate what has been already possible in Luxembourg, and I'm finding a lot of obstacles. So, for example, you can do surveys, of course, both here and there, but here, in many cases, there is the willingness to match and link the surveys with the administrative data to follow the trajectory and the career of people and see what was important in their career, in their change of status, etc., over time and various junctures of their life. But this is something that only in Norway, Denmark, and very few other countries, the governments are willing to share. So cross-county studies are very difficult. But I'm sure, at least as a conjecture, that if you could do that, then of course size matters. But even controlling for size and controlling for wealth, I believe that the experience of multicultural society does play a huge role in terms of eliminating the fear of the other.
So we have a great example in Luxembourg. That's not always the case in this podcast. Sometimes we also tend to complain a little bit, but here, good to know, we can be happy about that. But of course, you're in the beginning of that study, so I guess we can then talk later on what are the results, hopefully also positive. I guess this is actually the moment, as I want to finish on a positive note, although the pop quiz question is not so positive anymore, but it's definitely the moment to start wrapping up. So let's go back to the question that you asked in the beginning, related to trust as well. If you could remind our listeners what it was about, you don't need to give the numbers, just the whole idea, and then tell us actually what the answer is.
So the question is, how much do you think that is the percentage of plastic that we consume that is actually recycled at the end of the day? Yes, so I think that quiz is revealing about what is going on in terms of the reduction of trust, because the numbers tell us that the percentage that is actually recycled is very low, is around 15% in Europe on average, 12% for Italy, for example. And this is due to two other numbers, because it's important to know both how much people differentiate when they collect their garbage and how much do the institutions actually recycle out of the plastic that is differentiated. And so the numbers are roughly 43% of the plastic goes into separate plastic containers. So that's the action by the people. But then only 39% of the plastic that has been differentiated gets recycled by the institutions. So you can see that these two numbers constitute the equilibrium distrust phenomenon, because in one sense, the distrust in institutions is well placed if only 39% of the plastic that is differentiated gets recycled. And that feeds into at least part of the reasons why, in fact, only 43% of plastic users differentiate. And so it's difficult to get out of this problem. And so if the institutions want to go to rebuild trust, they have to start doing their own job. Fix the 39%, and then we'll see. But probably the people will fix the 43.
Probably, because it's also, I think, a European issue. I don't know about you, but when I travel, I'm pretty surprised that in some European Union countries, recycling is not as common.
Indeed. And again, now I haven't done this check on the numbers for different parts of Italy. But for example, if one goes to the famous work by Putnam on social capital, where he was looking at different cities in Italy, not only south-north, but also various other dimensions in terms of how much social capital there was, which includes trust, right? And many cases when social capital is low, people don't differentiate, people litter, people say, oh, yeah, everybody does it, and so on. So that's the type of equilibrium that it's difficult to change. But again, if the institutions do their part, we can hope that over time, with information and education, things will change. But of course, it's not easy.
Definitely not. I just realized that, we moved to Europe and we talked about Luxembourg and now also the trust in trash issue, as we could call it. But I didn't ask you about the US still, because as you're an expert there as well, is the solution also some kind of global policies for the issue of trust in the US? I guess not. This is a separate case that we need to figure out what to do with.
There were a few numbers came up yesterday that 73% also of the voters of Kamala Harris responded to questions about trust, that they do think that many political decisions are made to satisfy elites, interest groups, Wall Street, banks. And so clearly, if even among those who, in terms of values, are on the solidarity side, on the Democrat side, think that policies are so determined by money, that's a problem. Then, of course, within the Trump voters, that percentage of people who think that traditional politicians were following the elites goes up to 82%. But that's less surprising. What I found more surprising is that distrust is very radicated, is very strong, also among Democrats. And in fact, in the study that we do for Congress candidates, what we see is that the candidates, both on the Democratic side and on the Republican side, increase their language of anti-elite rhetoric and making commitments in the districts in which distrust has been increasing. So they are aware of this increasing distrust more in one district than in another, and they follow that. They best respond to that. And there are many Democrats who are adopting the populist language. In fact, many people say that maybe in 2016, had Sanders, the populist Democrat, won the primaries, then probably Sanders would have defeated Trump.
Yeah, it's maybe the language that you are applying to fight, but this is again comes back to the science communication we discussed in the beginning and trust in science as well, like the big question of how to fight, fake news and misinformation in science as well. Again, I've heard loads of people saying, yeah, just produce more content and try to be, at the forefront, and others say, no, go into quality.
Yeah. No, it's difficult to rebuild. There is an important example that I can give in terms of, whether we can make use of science to rebuild trust. Within a department, within a school, within a set of colleagues, it is definitely possible. So, for example, I've been working lately on the issues of inclusion, diversity, integration. That was not my traditional topic until a few years ago. And so in various departments, Bocconi, London School of Economics, etc., we have made the experiments to clarify things scientifically to ourselves. So what is a good definition of this? What is a good measure of this? How many people think this? How many people think that? And so among ourselves, but it takes a lot of time, once you find a common language, a common set of definitions, and you agree on a certain numbers, etc., then at the end, it is much easier to agree almost unanimously on what would be the right policy. But how can we replicate this at the level of society? Focus groups, maybe more deliberative democracy, making people at the local level decide more by themselves. Maybe, having more direct democracy on some domains, on the domains where perhaps being expert is not so important. At least on those domains, let local people take more responsibilities. Maybe that can be one way. But again, it's at the level of wild guesses of what could work.
Yes, and you also mentioned before when we were talking about bureaucracy, politics, and you talked about trust in media as well. And this is yet another layer, right? The social media and how right now we have all these echo chambers that actually reinforce our thinking rather than being able to build bridges.
Yes, indeed. The social media have been shown empirically also to be part of the amplification effect. For example, in Italy, the money that a party gets to campaign is proportional to the number of seats the party had in the previous election. So this per se created a barrier to entry, Because if in order to have money to campaign, you needed, before the advent of social media, to have already a seat in parliament, then of course this is a huge barrier of entry, which was perceived as one of the unfair things of traditional politics. And that's why when social media came about, the 5-Star Movement had a huge success because they could bring their causes to the people directly, bypassing the campaign restrictions.
All right, there's a lot to continue discussing. We could go on, I'm sure, but unfortunately the time is up. I'm looking at the clock. So what remains is just to thank you, Massimo, very much for coming today and telling us all about trust and so much more, all the interdisciplinary studies and research that you do.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this is it for today. Don't forget to subscribe, to follow us, to check what we are writing. We're present on all the social media. We talked about it, but we're there as well, talking about science and trust sometimes as well. If you have any suggestions for guests or you just want to reach out to us, remember we also have our brand new website, scilax.eu. And yes, keep listening and keep learning about science. This was Scilax, and my name is Hanna Siemaszko.